This is the Mules Rider Chronicles podcast.
Chapter 10, Juan Valdes and the Man with 1,000 Shells.
Hello out there, friends. I am Craig Marlette, your host, and I want to welcome you to today's episode of the Mules Rider Chronicles podcast. Today's story takes place in a small boarding hotel above a beatnik coffee house near DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. My band stayed there for a couple of months during the late 60s, and it was here that we met a man named Roy and learned a lesson about the power of a few friends, a free cigarette, and a cup of coffee during a person's or a nation's most trying times. So hop up here on my old mule, and let's get ready to meet Roy in today's story entitled Juan Valdes and the Man with 1,000 Shells.
I love coffee. I've loved it ever since my mother gave me my first drink when I was about 5. I took to it immediately and have appreciated it ever since. I especially like to open a new can of coffee just to get that first sniff before anyone else gets to it. Ooh. I can close my eyes and visualize myself as Juan Valdes, riding my mule from plant to plant, picking only the best high-grade beans to ship to my special friends around the world. I'm the superstar of Colombian coffee, the Supreme Court judge who decides what's suitable for human consumption and what is left over to be ground into instant sanka for the masses who don't know any better. Now, don't misunderstand me, but I hate Starbucks. As many times as I've tried to reconcile myself to the idea of their great success, it still doesn't make sense to me. It tastes like the old chicory brand I used to buy when I had a long night on the road and needed desperately to stay awake. It was so strong and bitter I couldn't possibly go to sleep for the bad taste that was still in my mouth after drinking it. Starbucks, that special blend probably concocted when some locker room attendant tossed a couple of Michael Jordan's game socks into a pot of boiling water and someone thought it was coffee. Not to mention the specialty blends like French roast, vanilla-flavored double mint mocha skim latte. Yuck.
Ooh, tell us how you really feel.
I guess there's no use crying about it, though. So many things in this life don't make sense anymore. It's probably the justice of God that we should start our mornings with a bitter reminder of what we have become. We are consumers, programmed to digest whatever the market delivers to the shelves of the malls and superstores of our world. Our hard drives have been taken over by Madison Avenue, and as we surf from channel to channel on our television screens, we learn what it takes to become everything they want us to be. And in the breaks that come at regular intervals between performing our duties, we drink Starbucks coffee to blot out any remaining memory cells that could remind us of a time when we were really free men.
Here, drink this. You look desperate.
But then there was Roy. I met Roy when I played music in Washington, D.C. in the late 1960s at a place called Cousin Nick's. He lived above Tasso's in a small boarding hostel near DuPont Circle, where my band brothers and I also had a couple of rooms. Tasso's was the beatnik coffee house in the basement below the hostel on 17th and O Avenue. Here jazz lovers gathered to snap their fingers to the music they loved, a sound that was quickly being drowned out by bands like ours, and the loud crescendo of beating conga drums at DuPont Circle every Friday and Saturday night. There, in the basement of Tasso's, jazz combos would play Thelonious Monk, Dizzy Gillespie, and Charlie Parker songs, in between readings of poetry by E.E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, Langston Hughes, and Ezra Pound.
The connotation of infinity sharpens the temporal splendor of this night. That justice is a blind goddess is a thing to which we black are wise. His bandage hides two festering sores.
Terms like groovy, hip, cool, and out of sight flavored the night air, which was filled with the fragrance of warm wine, beers, cigarettes, pot, and, of course, coffee. Just one floor above the clamor of it all, in a barren 8-by-10-foot room with a refrigerator, a radio, and no toilet, lived a man we knew only as Roy. We actually met Roy's shoes before we met the man himself. It was 4 a.m. after the gig at Cousin Nick's, and we were jamming away in one of our rooms, trying to work out the unfinished business of the night, like bleeding the brakes of our minds to let the bad air out so the fluidity of our lives could express itself in the purity we knew was in there somewhere. in the middle of an acoustic version of Little Wing, Foxy Lady, or some other fantasy that demanded more of us that night, a shoe hit the wall behind the mattress where our bass player, George, sat thumping away. A loud, hard Brogan-type shoe, like the kind worn by the construction workers who rose early in the morning and stomped through the hallways of our hostel on their way to work or to the labor pool. We stopped to take in this loud intrusion of our space, as though frozen in time and unsure of what it all meant. Then the voice, "Hey, knock it off before I call the cops. You got that whore in there, don't you?" By that whore he must have meant Mary, George's wife, who played the tambourine with her eyes closed while swaying to the beat of our music, improvised in a minor key on guitar, bass, and flute. Or Sheila, my artist girlfriend visiting from Florida, with her long blonde hair and her red, purple, and yellow horizontally striped Cheshire cat socks that went all the way up to her knees. Who would dare violate our peaceful little jam session and throw a shoe against the wall? Then the second shoe hit. That was it. We hurried into the narrow hallway outside of our one-room sanctuary to meet head-on for the first time the angry little man called Roy. He was drunk, and his face shone with that sheen that comes from years of muscatel wine, malt liquor, or cheap gin, and the occasional can of Sterno. He slobbered and cursed in a language reserved for those who only understand themselves. Made-up words dribbling from the stupor of a shrunken brain, like the one I'd seen in Howard Junior High School on display in the auditorium to show what happens to those who drink too much booze. That pickled brain in a lab jar sliced like a big cauliflower, revealing the overbroadened canals, damaged frontal lobes, and cerebellum destruction that had taken this otherwise good man to the grave. Now Roy stood there in the hallway like an attack dog, breathing through slobbering lips, not sure where he was, but sure he wasn't about to let no hippies take over his world and keep him up late by playing loud music and carousing all night with that whore. 2 slugs to the head and a brief tussle was all it took. Then back to our room to finish the jam, but with a little less volume. Even a bunch of rock and rollers can compromise once the point has been established. The next morning we met in the hallway as though nothing had happened the night before. "Hey, Roy, how you doing today?" I asked as we passed through the big front door out into the street in front of Tasso's. "Okay, boys," Roy replied without even looking up. "Got a smoke?" My brother passed him a couple of Winstons from the pack tucked under his belt. "One for later, man," Terry said as we strolled off to the local People's Drug Store for a beef and burger before going to DuPont Circle to check out the scene. Nearly every night the masses gathered in DuPont Circle to make a statement against the corrupt world of brown wingtip shoes and 2-button suits with silk neckties, against the flood of 9-to-5ers who drove around the circle, pointing from their BMWs and Volvos, pointing and wishing secretly that they too were able to be free. The beating drums and strumming guitars created an explosive atmosphere for the hundreds of hippies, black power revolutionaries, women libbers, and SDS members, passing out their handbills with messages against Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam, and capitalism in general. We only went there to score and pick up a blacklight or a poster and some incense for the jam that would take place that night after we got home from the gig. Cousin Nick's was sort of a crossover place. It used to be a Greek restaurant, but when Nick found out that the new generation lacked an affinity for stuffed cabbage and goat meat, he quickly made the turn toward cool and started bringing in bands and selling cheeseburgers. He was no dummy, and he even seemed to get into the new music himself. I can still see him with his big hairy pot belly, standing in the swinging kitchen doorway with his sweaty T-shirt and tomato-stained apron yelling, "Turn it down, some boys," but not really meaning it, just establishing that he owned the joint in case anybody there didn't already know that. Like the night we'd taken some sunshine LSD that had come up from Florida in the mail. We couldn't get in tune to save our lives. Ping, 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 went the little E string on my guitar as I passed my brother going dum 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 the other way on the bottom E string of his electric Fender bass. For nearly an hour we laughed hysterically and tried to get in tune while Nick queried, "What's wrong with you boys tonight? Something wrong with your instruments?" No one else seemed to notice that much. "Must be the air conditioner, Nick," I said, still laughing uncontrollably for no reason at all. "I think the humidity is getting to my strings." Pretty soon, though, we found our groove and things went back to normal. Then there was Goldie, who lived with his girlfriend Mary on the 5th floor above Tasso's. He was in the Marines, but took a lot of a drug called DMT. We went up there every now and then to check on him because he seemed so far out, and we worried about him and his girlfriend. I even tried it once myself, puffing on the pipe filled with something that melted like silly putty right before my eyes and took me into the world of Goldie, a world filled with 3-headed pigs and gophers wearing spacesuits that imitated Jose Jimenez. "Is that a crash helmet you're wearing?" the first pig said. "Oh, I hope not," was the reply, as I looked on in wonder. It was over my head, and I never wanted to go there again. Goldie and Mary were the first people I ever knew who spoke in tongues. But it wasn't like the Pentecostals I've known since. I think Mary was from Nairobi, and somehow whatever they took gave them a gibberish language that they both seemed to understand. I used to marvel that he could get up every day and go to the base for his job in the Marines. I guess it kept him from going to Vietnam, so it wasn't all bad. My brother Terry lived in a little 3-foot-deep half-circle cubbyhole in the wall above the refrigerator. It was part of the room design and had just enough space for a blanket and pillow. He had a poster of Jane Mansfield stapled on the ceiling of his cubbyhole and went by the nickname Spiderweb Head. This was because he had decided he didn't like his straight hair, and Pete's sister Trish had permed it, hoping to give him an afro. The resulting look was similar to a long black wig from a clothing store mannequin that someone had blown up with a cherry bomb. He was way ahead of his time with that one. I see that style everywhere now, and it costs $50 to get it done. But Roy remained a mystery. At least twice a week the Brogan shoes would hit the wall, followed by the familiar rant we had come to know so well. "You got that whore in there, don't you?" And early the next evening as we left for Cousin Nick's, "Hey boys, got a cigarette?" And the reply, "Sure, Roy, have a couple." When we finally decided it was time to look in on Roy during the daylight, my brother and I went and knocked on his door. Our curiosity high, we still had a backup plan of asking for a cigarette from the hefty base of credit we had been establishing for weeks at the front door downstairs. He opened the door and after a brief exchange invited us into the private world of Roy, that 8 by 10-foot space with a little refrigerator and the Budweiser clock on the wall and the smell of fresh brewed coffee coming from the alloy percolator gurgling away on the hot plate on the little stand next to his bed. He offered us a cup, and we sat down to have a smoke together with Roy. He told us he was a carpenter, which was obvious from the 1 by 6-inch unfinished pine shelving that went from floor to ceiling on every wall in his room. Each shelf spaced precisely 6 inches above the other, separated only by the brackets screwed to the wall every 2 or 3 feet. On one shelf there were homemade mailboxes, like the slotted ones at the village postal office long ago where the postman sat with a little elastic armband around his shirt sleeves. There were so many shelves, if one were to take them all down, there would be enough lumber to build a small cabin. And on most of the shelves there was nothing, except for the single wooden shelf above the refrigerator where he kept his wine, his Vienna sausages, and a bag of ground coffee. Not Yuban or Sanka, not Instant Maxwell House or any other brand of the popular hard crystals sold in 8-ounce jars with the twist-off lids, being pushed into TV ads on I Love Lucy or Ed Sullivan or Name That Tune. It was real red-blooded American coffee, the kind Rowdy made by the campfires on the long cattle drives across Montana, Texas, and Wyoming, the kind Della Street made for Perry Mason before he would leave for the courtroom to face Hamilton Berger and win the day for some hapless victim of the system. The strong, smooth cup of brew that Matt Dillon lifted from the pot-bellied stove in a tin cup at the jailhouse where the hob-legged Deputy Chester prepared the brew while Marshal Dillon and Doc played checkers. Roy had been jilted by a whore, tormented by his neighbors, driven from the public arena to the insane, monotonous drudgery of life as a manic shelf builder. And there was only one thing that kept him from slipping over the precipice to join the finger poppers down at Tasso's, those lost gypsies hiding from the coming tide of fuzz tones, electric basses, and drums with 2 pedals, signs in the road of life marking their extinction, like the Dixieland banjo players that had reigned before them not so very long ago. And what was the one stabilizing influence that saved Roy from the abyss? Coffee. Good, solid, pure, home-brewed coffee made from beans purchased at the AMP, ground fresh daily, and poured into the 1-pound bag, now proudly on display on the shelf above Roy's refrigerator, in the 8-by-10-foot room on the floor just above Tasso's. We drank together with Roy in silence, as though we knew our time would come when we too would join the ranks of shelf builders, outdated dinosaurs fit only to listen to remixed versions of the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, the Moody Blues, and Frank Zappa on CDs sold at Barnes & Noble's for $16.99, paid for with credit cards, handed to cashiers standing only feet away from the pastry bar where young men and women sit reading their self-help books and sipping blindly on the bitter nectar that represents the life I have come to despise. And I sit alone in a corner booth with my cup of smuggled Folgers, snuck in the door through the radar detector meant for people like me, muttering under bated breath, "You got that whore in there, don't you? Knock it off or I'll call the cops."
Well, thanks for joining me today for another story from my own crazy life. I hope you found something in it that will help you as you journey through the twists and turns of life here on planet Earth. If nothing else, maybe just a brief respite from your own insanity and a little laugh on me. If you like the show, be sure to tell all your friends and invite them to join us on the journey as well. You can find us in the iTunes Store, on Stitchers, YouTube, Facebook, TuneIn, and wherever it was that you found us to listen in today. So until next time, this is the Mules Rider saying, so long.